Hello and welcome to the Expanse. I'm Mitch the Quack and I hope you're having a less quack day than myself. Today we're going to be talking about the Shadowlands, specifically the fact that Shadowlands is a realm of Anima, and why that may be one of the most important reveals from BlizzCon 2019. So, the Shadowlands is powered by Anima, which as Ian described is basically the accumulated experience of a soul, which within the Shadowlands is a form of power. It's a simple enough description, until you realise that Anima has a physical form in the physical universe, and seems to be one of the materials used in creating Titanforged. How do I know this? Well, when I first started speculating, and I mean properly researching WoW's lore, one of the first places I ever went to was Throne of Thunder. The reason why I went there was because all raids carry important lore. Whether it be immediate or foreshadowed, blatant or hidden, all raids carry important lore. At the time, Throne of Thunder to me was one of the few raids that seemed to be an outlier. As in, yes, we found out Raden was a thing, and there was some foreshadowing for Xul, but other than that, most of the raids seemed excessively pointless. That was until I realised Raden was using Anima and Vita Orbs to empower himself, and kept shouting out,
"The touch of creation and destruction."
Once those two aspects clicked and a bit more research was done, everything in TOT started to make a lot more sense, and for me became some of the most important lore in all of World of Warcraft. Now, fast forwarding to the World of Warcraft What's Next panel, and the second I heard the word Anima, I couldn't stop laughing, because not only did I get some of my old theories confirmed, it's now most definitely an important piece of lore. I'll also warn now, I do go on a considerable tangent within this theory, but it does all come back to the Shadowlands. And if you've been around long enough to remember parts of my Azerite explained content, then you're already going to have an idea of where this is going. So in lore, what is Anima? Anima is basically spirit / blood, or more precisely aged spirit that can come in the form of blood in the physical universe. How do we know this? Well, other than the fact MOP lore was basically an expansion-long introduction to the concept of spirit, the big giveaway to what Anima actually is comes in the form of Chronicle Volume 1, which states, "Spirit is a life-giving force that interconnects and binds all things in existence as one." Now, there are many ways you can read the Chronicle series, and the way I have generally read it is along the lines of assuming the statements made are true, however lack a massive amount of context. This statement about spirit, however, is one of the few statements that has never been proven to lack context. Spirit, in World of Warcraft, is a life-giving force that binds all things in existence as one, and its relation to Anima comes in the form of Primodius, the Dark Animus, and fundamentally the flesh-shaping project of the Mogu, and in turn, the Titans. Anima is basically the substance used for flesh shaping, meaning yes, Anima is flesh as well. The only reason why Anima is different to the creatures of stone and metal made by the Titans is because Anima, in the beginning at least, seems to have 5 of the elements present, specifically spirit, earth, fire, air, and water, and over time it will accumulate the 6th element, decay. Titanforged, in one way, shape, or form, are usually lacking one of the 4 basic elements, and are seemingly lacking spirit, and or decay. We know this thanks to monks and chi. Chi being another word for spirit. One of the staple abilities of a Windwalker monk is Storm, Earth and Fire. The implication here is a monk is using their own spirit to project the 4 elements out of their body to fight alongside them. Specifically, Earth, Fire, and a fusion of air and water in Storm. I'd also like to point out that if you'd ever like to get a more thorough crash course in how this concept kind of came to be in my mind and how it seems to relate to everything, I would highly suggest reading the first chapter of Chronicle Volume 2, which goes over the origins of Draenor, as that chapter overall introduces and explains this concept in a very lore-driven manner. I'll also throw this out there now. This should really make you wonder about what Yogg did to the Titan forging process to cause the Curse of Flesh. Also, does the reason why Uldir is so important and the reason why G'huun is so dangerous become clear now? If not, just say in the comments and I'll eventually make a discussion on it. Now, the reason why Chi and Spirit come back to Anima in TOT is specifically because of Primodius, who, I'm not gonna lie, I think is one of the saddest creatures ever created in World of Warcraft. The reason I say this is because Primordius was a flesh-shaped experiment created by the Mogu, like all Sauron Grummels, which is bad enough because the Mogu had little to no clue as to what they were doing, and the results were the monsters in the second and third wings of TOT, but what happened next was even worse. When TOT was abandoned, Primordius was left in pools of Anima, as in a substance that will fundamentally break down the 4 elements a creature is comprised of, and fuse them into one substance because of the abundance of spirit within the liquid. Meaning yes, that red sludge, / blood, / anima, / spirit in TOT was a lot worse than we originally thought. What's more horrifying though is imagine being conscious for all of this, and not dying after you've been fused into the anima. That's the disturbing thing about the anima in TOT. It doesn't fundamentally break down spirit, it just glues it to other forms of spirit in a liquid amalgamation. Now I just mentioned the Mogu had no clue as to what they were doing, and I do mean it. As I mentioned at the start, and this was confirmed by Ian, Anima is basically aged spirit, meaning unless you excise the personalities from the Anima, they will remain alive, unless overtaken by a more powerful spirit, and even then, there's no guarantee the personality will fade. So what I'm basically getting at is the Mogu were trying to flesh shape with quote-unquote used materials. The reason why Primordius uses the term we, the reason why it's always in pain, the reason why it knows the dark, and the reason why it makes out it's been killed multiple times is because every time a creature was killed and reshaped within the anima, the Mogu didn't cleanse the spirits. They remained conscious in the anima, where they were painfully moulded and fused into new forms, experiencing every painful death and recreation. So what Primordius proves is what anima is in the physical universe. It is the way a physical form is created, and is technically the essence of a creature in a liquid state. I'll eventually explain that statement. On a side note, Primordius may give us an insight into what decay is, though it's a weird definition. And what I mean by that is a staple mechanic of Primordius is evolution, as in the ability to adapt. If anima is used as spirit, then you'd assume decay has to be present in some form or another, otherwise it would remain as pure spirit. So decay could quite possibly be the opposite aspect of spirit, which allows spirit to adapt, which as time goes on eventually burns out the spirit of a creature and kills them. This part is very hypothetical though, and it's just food for thought. The last thing about anima I need to touch on is how it's manipulated, because from the looks of it, it is not easily manipulated. The only way the Thunder King was actually able to create the Animus, a golem powered by anima, was with the use of dark emotions. So the assumption I'm going with is, because the anima in TOT was so overused and rife with souls for experiments, the only way the Thunder King could actually control the anima was by using his anger to override the tormented wills within the anima. What's rather ironic, however, is if he actually knew how to use the lightning he had stolen, I'm pretty sure he would have had an easier time creating the Animus. But I'll go back to the importance of Vita later. So at this point I've hopefully established anima, blood, spirit. Basically it's the essence of a creature that can fuse and alter the elements, and over time may slowly accumulate decay, which will help a creature adapt, but may also eventually be the reason the creature dies. This is where the Shadowlands and the Machinery of Death comes into play. What is the point of the Shadowlands? The reason the Shadowlands seems to exist is to purify anima, so it can be redistributed into the universe, hence the Shadowlands being older than the Titans, because if it wasn't there after the conflict of creation, everything would have just ended up in oblivion after it died, and in turn, creation would have died. This also explains the Arbiter's purpose of maintaining balance, and the name of the Arbiter's stronghold, Oribus, which is most likely a reference to Ouroboros and the infinite cycle of the universe. This is where things get interesting though, because the Shadowlands, from everything we've been told so far, is a realm of anima, of spirit, meaning if it's similar to the anima in the physical universe, you'd assume it would have the same properties, like being formless or highly sticky. And my response to that is yes and no for two reasons. The first is an IRL equivocation to the different states of liquid and gas. Spirit/anima can exist as liquid in the form of the blood present in TOT, but as we've seen throughout World of Warcraft, spirits can also appear in various ethereal forms, arguably the gaseous form of spirit. The one problem with this analogy is it doesn't explain why the properties of spirit don't seem to matter in the Shadowlands. As in, you can change the state of water all you want, but it's still H2O at the end of the day, meaning Anima/spirit should still technically retain the ability to fuse together, willingly or not. And this is where the second reason becomes very important: Vita. Vita, from what I can tell, is how most life retains its form. The best analogy I can think of is, think of the trope of Frankenstein's monster being struck by lightning and being given life. Lightning, or more precisely a special form of lightning, at least for the Titans, seems to be a way of forcing Anima, spirit, into solid forms, fundamentally creating life. So basically imagine sculpting a soldier out of Anima, which is alive but it can't retain its shape. So you strike it with lightning and bam, it retains its shape, and you have the creature you desired. That is what Vita does. Now, there is one other possibility to how the Titans created life, and it relates to the Titan engines like the engine of Nalik Shah, creating constellations similar to Elegon and the ones in Ulduar, encoding them in Anima, but at the end of the day, Vita still plays the same role of solidifying the two forms together. Now, in the physical universe, there is an excessive amount of Vita. Without it, pretty much none of the mortal races would exist. It's basically the reason the normal mortal races hold distinct physical forms and can't change them at will. Without Vita, there would probably be an excessive amount of Anima, similar to the stuff in TOT, found throughout the universe. And I know the first response to that is, well, how do you explain druids and shapeshifters? And I could go into the influence the six magics have on everything as well, but that's a topic for another day that I've technically covered in WoW Cosmology Explained Part 1. It's old content with iffy sound quality, but from memory, at least a few of the principles within it are still relevant. Anyway, sticking to the Shadowlands, from what I just described, the Shadowlands has the presence of Vita, or possibly certain magics. I'm not going to go into that today, hence the separation of spirits. One peculiar thing about the Shadowlands, I would argue though, is the presence of Vita is not as strong as it is in the physical universe, hence why none of the zones in the Shadowlands are physically connected to each other. For if they were, the spirits would start to lose their distinction. Now, at this point, I had this part where I would explain what I thought was going on with the Kyrian and how their existence would explain that aspect of the Shadowlands, but then a really insightful interview from the Lost Codex came out. The link will be in the top corner and description. The interview basically confirms this theory. I highly suggest watching that interview as it gives you a really good insight into the lore of the Shadowlands, but the long and short of the part of the interview I'm talking about is the idea the regions within the Shadowlands slowly change mortal spirits to match their environments. So for example, if a human spirit arrives in Bastion, over time if it followed the rituals, its form would eventually change into a Kyrian and eventually a spirit healer. And so if there were two areas that were connected, say Revendreth and Bastion, this process might actually occur and instead there may be a stagnation within the spirit, and or it may just turn into an amalgamation of some sort. The only other thing I can really add to this explanation of how the Shadowlands environments change the mortal spirits is adding to the how, which seems to be expressly related to Vita, or the stars, or the structure of the physical universe, but I'm going with Vita for this theory. And so, something that instantly stood out to me about the Kyrian and Bastion, other than the references to the Halls of Valor, which is another video in the making, was how the Kyrian were cleansing spirits. Because if you didn't notice, we've seen the Kyrian cleansing rituals, off the top of my head, at least 3 times before on Azeroth. The first time was Argent Confessor Paltress in the Trial of Champions, where she brought out our memories for us to fight. The second time was the Divine Bell, and in a more passive sense, all of Pandaria, where our emotions literally became manifestations. And the third time was in Vol'dun with Akunda, where we literally fought excised memories of creatures after the creature had been struck by lightning and had that memory placed in a jar. Now, if you've watched Amon'thul's Power Explained, you already know the full context of this, but stick around because the Shadowlands adds context that takes that theory to the next level. In 2 of these cases, I would argue spirit is being manipulated to manifest parts of a creature's soul, while in the other case we see a creature's Vita shifted just enough to excise a certain aspect of that creature's soul, specifically memory. And once again, due to the lack of Vita within the Shadowlands, these cleansing processes not only mentally change a creature, but physically change them due to the lack of Vita keeping that creature's form. Now, I'll admit, I don't think the Kyrian misused this power. Bastion is specifically designed for those who are willing to serve in life and are willing to keep the balance. However, could you imagine what would happen if a creature in the physical universe, like Zira, had this ability? Well, actually she kind of does. We help Tapatos go through at least one of these processes during the light forging process. It just happens to be excessively more intrusive. Oh, and with this notion of cleansing anima and in the process reshaping a creature fresh in the mind, I might as well mention this. Back in MOP, we were introduced to the idea that
water is life.
The statement overall, and to this day, didn't make much sense. That was until you applied the analogy of anima in TOT being the equivalent of contaminated water, or more precisely, contaminated/aged spirit. If you just clicked on to what the Titans were probably doing in Pandaria, I know, that is absolutely terrifying. And if you haven't, the implication here is the Titans were trying to mimic the process of purifying spirit outside of the Shadowlands. Most obviously in Pandaria, but most likely in other areas, which, thinking about it, actually may prove how the Titans were trying to cleanse Azeroth. Whether this was for the greater good or not is a different question, but this seems to be how they were trying to cleanse Azeroth. Anyway, this explains the facilities in Pandaria, as in the Terrace of Endless Springs, the Purifying section, the Engine of Alakshar, the Forge, and TOT, Waste Storage, or Contamination Storage. I mean, I know that takes away from the luster of TOT, but I just want to remind everyone where yes, TOT was originally located on a mountain, the area surrounding TOT post-Sundering turned into a swamp, which, after Nazmir, should heavily be related to the idea of Titan dumping grounds. Coming back to the Shadowlands, this process of purification raises one very big question that is actually easy to answer, but also implies a lot. Is this process of purification reversible? As in, can you create mortal races or other races out of the anima and the denizens of the Shadowlands? I'd be willing to say yes, and when I finish another theory I'm working on, which at the moment I'm just calling the Nathrazim conspiracy, why that may be important in regards to the Shadowlands and possibly the whole cosmology may become very clear and very important. The last things in regard to anima I'm going to mention are the ideas of shadow corrupted anima and near uncleansable anima, if not just uncleansable anima. During the final phase of the fight with Ra-Den in TOT, it becomes apparent there is some form of corruption present within Ra-Den, hence why the orbs turn a shade of purple. I'd be willing to say that this is shadow corruption, which seems to be distinctly lacking in the Shadowlands, and might have something to do with Revendreth, and the fact that the light has a harmful effect on the creatures within the zone. When it comes to the near uncleansable or possibly uncleansable anima, I need to refer to the Lost Codex interview, because the general understanding gleaned from the relevant responses within the interview are creatures that die within their home realms have their energies returned to that realm. So if a creature of death dies in the Shadowlands, its personality will die, but the energy will return to the Shadowlands because it's the final location for that energy. Now, where that makes sense in regards to personalities, there is one gaping hole in that explanation when it comes to the energy of that spirit, and that is the existence of the Maw versus Revendreth, a place of the damned versus a place of penance. I personally figure there are two possible explanations for this separation. The first possibility is there are irredeemable personalities but cleansable anima, meaning the Maw is meant to lock away personalities that will never repent. There are ways to cleanse the anima of these dark personalities, but the process is apparently so difficult the Arbiter is better off imprisoning them. The one problem I have with that explanation is the existence of Revendreth, and how it seems to serve the purpose of penance and redemption, implying the spirit, and personalities that define that spirit, sent to the Maw, are both irredeemable. The second possibility is no, there are actually ways to completely ruin spirit/anima and make it irredeemable, hence the existence and difference between the Maw and Revendreth. The IRL equivocation of this would be antimatter versus dark matter if you could create antimatter out of matter. As in, when antimatter and matter come into contact, they will destroy each other, no questions asked. World of Warcraft's equivalent is true death, the void creation, oblivion, etc. The idea here is, once you cross that threshold into true death, you're not coming back. On the other hand, there is dark matter, which is just another form of matter. World of Warcraft's equivalent is the Shadow, which, as I've stated in other content, is just another form of magic related to creation. Now, I'm assuming the Maw is where WoW's equivalent of antimatter spirits go within the Shadowlands, and could have quite specifically been created by the Shadowlands for this purpose. However, if this theory is correct, then the Maw represents some form of true death, oblivion, etc. manifest within the Shadowlands, with the implication being this form of death might equate to or stretch into other magics, and may not just be present within the Shadowlands. Hence N'Zoth's knowledge, overt warnings, and overall attempts to take over Azeroth before the Jailer could truly make its move. And if we really want to push this theory, with the lack of Vita present in the Shadowlands, it would be very, very bad if the Jailer was the equal opposite of the Arbiter, which, I'm not going to lie, seems pretty likely at this point considering we have an entity of balance, the Arbiter, and imbalance, the Jailer. The reason why this would be bad is because if the damned within the Maw are similar to the Kyrian, except instead of going through the process of tranquility and cleansing, which leads them to becoming a spirit healer, and instead the damned go through a process of pain and suffering, which instead of ascending them to a spirit healer or even a corrupted spirit healer, leads them instead to becoming something far worse, that is also irreversible, we are quite possibly looking at some very powerful and tragic enemies ahead. I mean, could you imagine if all of our favourite characters that have died are turned into powerful, faceless, irredeemable monsters that we have no choice but to put down, because there is absolutely no way to save them? In my opinion, where that would be terribly sad, it would also set up some really good storytelling in the future. The final thing I'm going to mention is something off topic, but I guarantee this will have you thinking. In Chronicle Volume 1, the Shadowlands is described as being full of realms of nightmarish decay. Obviously the Shadowlands reveal proves otherwise. Or does it? You know how I mentioned at the start there are ways of reading Chronicle? Well, think about that statement in relation to tense and the fact Chronicle is an account of the history of World of Warcraft. So instead of the Shadowlands being a realm of nightmarish decay, what if the Shadowlands was a place of nightmarish decay? The follow-up question being, who or what, when and why did things change? I mean, as is said, no king rules forever, but you can't kill death. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a nice day.